I'm Jeff Gibbon with American Purpose. We're going to run an hour, so hard stop at 1 p.m. Eastern. I know we have people from across the United States and other parts of the world, including Europe. Those who are in Europe and it's evening, thanks for your time and breaking from dinner and whatever else you have going on tonight. This is a pleasure and this is a privilege for a number of different reasons. I'm very excited about this program. We're going to record it. We're going to post it. The YouTube video will be available. Please share it with friends. Please post it in social media. But we've tried to keep the group relatively intimate so that we can have a conversation and a participant-intensive exchange. Our guests of honor are Francine Stock and Sofi Oksanen. Francine is today in England at the border of Wales. She is a British novelist and political and social and cultural commentator. She's done work for the BBC and any number of outlets. She's been with us before with film critic David Thompson, now based in San Francisco, and she is elegant and thoughtful and stimulating in a number of ways. And Carolyn or Rebecca, if I could ask you now or in due course, please put some of Francine's work into chat so that people can access some of these things. And then similarly, Sofi, who is joining us today from Helsinki, but who was in the United States recently for an extended visit on the West Coast, is a novelist and prolific, and like Francine, acclaimed and award-winning. She is also a political and social and culture commentator. Sofi did an interview for us not so long ago on Finlandization. We talk a lot about Finlandization in Eastern Europe and Ukraine. She lived it and had very interesting things to say, and that can be seen on the American Purpose site, and perhaps Rebecca or Carolyn can put that in chat. We've titled this Art and Occupation. It's not a straitjacket. The conversation will go in any which way, and whatever Francine and Sofi decide, in a word, and then I'll step back now, in a word, two truly gifted individuals who know politics, literature, fiction, and fact, if I may put it that way. And I think we're just eager to listen to you in conversation and pepper you with questions toward the end. So Sofi, welcome. Francine, welcome. And Francine, to lead off, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And Sofi, it's an absolute pleasure to meet you, albeit virtually like this. And I have very much enjoyed becoming acquainted with your work. I want to start by asking you really about a question. I mean, you know, biographically, people say, oh, well, she's a Finnish writer. Sometimes we see that. How would you describe, if you had to describe yourself, how you feel in terms of where you come from, where your loyalties are, how would you do that?
Thank you, Francine, and nice to meet you and all the people somewhere there. This is a very special time for an author like me, because I have written about Soviet occupation since 2003, when my debut novel came out in Finland. I was brought up between Soviet Union and Finland. So I'd say that I was brought up by swinging on the Iron Curtain. My mother is Estonian. She was born to Soviet-Estonia at the time. And my father is a Finn who used to work all around Soviet Union for almost 30 years. So this was my cultural surrounding in the world I was brought to. And it was a very good, actually, for an author, because I could see from outside and from inside both realities. And at the time, Finland was under Finlandization, so the political atmosphere was complicated, to say the least. And so I have been following up all these things, swinging on the Iron Curtain. And I define myself as a post-colonial author because most of my fiction is focusing on Estonia's recent past, the double occupation and its consequences, to Soviet occupations and German occupation. And my latest novel, Dog Park, which is situated on the border of Russia in all on different levels, is very much focusing on Ukraine, and the main character in the novel is a Ukrainian lady. So it's about corruption. I wanted to write about corruption, how it affects the everyday life of ordinary people, and that's one of the big post-colonial themes as well. Or I don't know, should we say neo-colonial themes nowadays? But anyway, this is the colonialism and its consequences are kind of my big theme in my work. And sadly, it's more topical than it has been for a long time.
Yes, because Dog Park, you could read it now in so many different ways. It could be read as some great metaphor, well, as well as, for the narrative itself. So I think that's absolutely right. And actually, since occupation is our theme, though I'm sure we'll travel elsewhere in the next half hour or so. Occupation, of course, the pathology of occupation, or the pathology of colonialism, if you like, is that it's not just military or political, it's pervasive, isn't it? It goes through culture or commerce or all kinds of ways. I mean, that clearly is something that fascinates you.
Yes, I've always been more interested in the backstage, so to say, or the kitchen, more than what's happening on front lines. But also, you can say that Finlandization was a mental occupation. In Estonia, the Soviet occupation, the German occupations were military occupations. And but when you think about, when the Second World War ended in Baltic states, it didn't end actually, not even with regaining the independence in the beginning of 90s, but when the Soviet troops left, which happened in 94. But that doesn't mean, again, the military is something that we can actually see. But when you think about the values, it's also about the values. When we talk about Soviet occupation, or now the Russian occupation in Ukraine, then it's not only about the military. Military is the threat that is forcing the occupation, but it's also about changing the values, changing also the language, and because in Estonia and now also in Russian occupied territories in Ukraine, the Russian language is becoming the dominant or the default language. And it's about, trying to destroy the national identity and the national values as well. So it's also about destroying the values, national identities, culture. Education is key again, and what's the difference when I think about now what's happening in Ukraine, in Russian occupied territories, and in Estonia, there are, of course, striking similarities, because occupational tools are pretty much the same, whatever the century. It's, of course, horrible that it's 2022 and still the tools of occupations are the same. And also the way Russia is using hunger as a weapon is again something we know from the history. Also, the manipulation of genocide is again something that we know from Russia. It's been in the Russian toolbox for a very long time, so they know how to play it. And also the question about the genocide. And what's especially from Baltic point of view, it is absolutely heartbreaking to see again, you know, the same things that happened in Baltic states in 40s happening in Ukraine, and that is the deportations. I mean, Russians have even themselves have said that they have taken 300,000 children from Ukraine. And now the children are in Russia and on fast lanes to be adopted to Russian families, which means that they will be Russian citizens, and it will be even more difficult to bring them back home. We don't know if it's even possible, hopefully so. But, you know, even, you know, and also seeing war crimes like rape, torture, execution of civilians, these are exactly the same things that have happened in Estonia, but especially the deportations. I mean, the things that you wouldn't think that belong to the modern world or warfare at all. You think about that this is all about, you know, the disinformation online or war propaganda online, but it's also about very old tools like deportations and things like that, you know, like deportation and what it does to the national identity and the nation. It is something that, you know, you simply will not forget that. It's something that will affect the future, definitely.
And I mean, clearly it's very graphically there now, but I mean, it's interesting if you go back to, say, your novel Purge, where there's an element of deportation there, the separation of families, and and we see this over 3 generations, the effect that this has. You clearly felt when you were writing it at that time, did you feel that this was something that people were beginning to forget, or that it wasn't high enough in their consciousness that these things had happened?
That's a good question, because, you know, but it was already when I started to write my first novel in the beginning of 2000 something, at the time when Putin became a powerful man in our neighboring country, that I noticed that the winds of change started to get a bit chilly for Estonians. Finns at the time didn't notice that, nor did actually people in Western countries, because they still had this wishful thinking of Russia being on the path to democracy. But Estonians didn't feel like that. Simply because Russia started to use be very aggressive in all things related to history. That started already 20 years ago. And there was simply no possibility to have a conversation with Russia about what had happened, about the crimes committed during the Soviet occupation, about deportation. There was simply not a dialogue that would have been required for coming to terms with the past. It became very clear that Russia's history politics is going to be falsified. They are not going to let Baltic states to write their own history, that they are going to manipulate the memory of genocide. It was all very clear at the time. And as I understood that, I also understood that at the same time, people of my age in Western countries, they started to think that Soviet Union didn't matter. It was not a matter of interest. It was something that felt very like something belonging to the dust box of the history, and nothing. It was not about the future. So in that way, I felt that, you know, literature is a very good tool to get also those people interested on these matters, who otherwise wouldn't, you know, they wouldn't watch a documentary about the Soviet Union or deportations, but they might actually read a book, because book is a fiction, work of fiction has different ways of coming to you. It can grow on to you. You really can actually identify with the characters and start to understand the world they are living. And in that way, I think fiction is, I'm not saying that it is more powerful than journalism, because journalism has definitely a very important role in the world. And when you think about the rule of law, then, you know, journalism is crucial. But, you know, when you think about really like understanding of the realities of a certain system, then fiction is definitely a very powerful tool. But I don't know, you might think, I mean, you have written both fiction and you're a journalist, so you have different aspects on the how to bring the story to the people.
Well, that's why I'm so interested in your work, because I think that you're very detailed about process. You're very detailed, very precise also about language, which obviously language is very important in occupation as well, and it's very important in the kind of cultural dominance that an occupying or colonial force can have. And I think that there's ways of sort of activating the way people think about things through fiction that are actually have a long-lasting effect, whereas intellectually you can appreciate something. With journalism, I think particularly now when there is, you know, sort of saturation coverage of things, that people look at whatever that dose is of that day and then they go, oh, it's better or worse than the day before, and then they slightly stop thinking about it after that, because you can't really take in anymore. Whereas of course I think the great strength of literature and fiction, you know, particularly, is that it you know, it's subtle, it gets in there, and then it, if you like, it occupies parts of your brain, and stays there, you know, in a way that you may not remember the exact facts or you see, I think that's what you're very clever at doing, is sort of without layering on too much of the factual context, and it must be a difficult balance for you to decide when you're writing it. Just to suggest what's happening. You know,
no, that's definitely true. You know, when you are writing a historical novel, you have to make the world alive, and there are so many interesting details in the history. You know, you would love to have them all in your story, but then you have to pick and choose the one you want to keep, and if they don't bear any kind of symbolic meaning or metaphorical meaning in the novel, then I'll just toss them out. And then sometimes it's very difficult, I admit that, because, you know, history is filled with super interesting details. But I try to keep the my metaphorical and symbolic, you know, levels somehow consistent, so that they are in the same world and creating a solid framework for the story. So in that way, it's but it's tough. It's definitely tough sometimes. And then one thing is that well, you know, there are so many wonderful movies and TV shows, you know, historical shows nowadays, even though not that much about Eastern European countries, let alone Baltic states, and not about Russian history, let alone Ukrainian history, except for few exceptions. That I try to also focus on those things that actually a screen cannot convey. Like, you know, I try to take into account all senses, that is the smell and what you, well, you know, there's an audio on anything related to the screen, but I try to focus on what something actually feels and what something, you know, the scents are very important to me, because that is something that you cannot get from the screen.
Absolutely, yes, and it's the thing that people will very much retain, that kind of, I mean,
Yes.
But you're writing, of course, for well, obviously since the success of your early novels, you're writing for an international readership. I mean,
Yeah.
are you conscious of that there may be very low levels of understanding or of the history of that period?
Well, in Latin America, I have met readers who have told me that they didn't know anything about the Second World War, and to them it was a shock to the idea of Europe was that, you know, there's prosperity and peace, and, you know, everybody everybody seems to be living some sort of, you know, rich life, you know. And to them, it was a kind of revolutionary moment, you know, to understand that we also have experienced war. And I think for me as an author, the most interesting conversation actually I've had with Latin Americans, because, well, they have complicated history in every single country. And for them, my work is something they can actually relate to, because they do know something about, you know, complicated past. They do something about the limitation of freedom of speech, repressions, torture. Everything is something they do know. So in that way, and for them, it was a surprise to see that actually, you know, things like that Europeans know these kind of histories as well. So in that way, that has been those were the most interesting, you know, conversation, and also something that told me that actually, you know, art can connect people. Art can connect people in a surprising way, simply because we get connected. They understood Europe better. I understood better, you know, all different Latin American countries and what they are. So in that way, that was a moment of connection for me. But when I write, I do not think about, you know, that I'm going to write to an international audience. I cannot think like that. But on the other hand, I do have one thing that actually, because I write in Finnish. Finnish is my writing language. And I already, when I started to write my first debut novel, I was writing about Estonia, about, you know, in Finnish, about another country where my fictional characters are actually, their native language is not Finnish. So, and there are so many expressions, I hear them talking Estonian in my head, but I write them in Finnish. So, and then I already understand that my Finnish readers, they might not have experienced or lived through this. They might not have seen this location, for example, I'm writing about. So in that way, that actually helps. It gives a certain distance, which is required, but also it helps me to find expressions that I hope are more understandable to the reader, because I cannot use very local phrases that are understandable only to Estonians. And for example, when I was writing Dog Park, I had my Ukrainian friend reading the manuscript before it was printed, because I wanted really to, you know, see what his Ukrainian ear is saying about every single expressions. And then we changed, for example, certain expressions, because I wanted to use like Ukrainian proverbs, which of course are not understandable to, you know, Finns or anyone else unless they understand Ukrainian. And then I removed expressions that I thought were universal, but my Ukrainian friend said that these are not understandable for a Ukrainian. So that was a very interesting linguistic conversation about different small details.
And reading Dog Park, it seems extraordinarily prescient that it should be published at this moment. I mean, it's a book ostensibly about one woman and well, two women really who are involved in the fertility industry, which I haven't realized, but subsequently have read it was a big thing in Ukraine. I mean, why that particular thing at this particular moment? Why did you want to write about Ukraine now?
Since 2014, I had the feeling that Western media kind of forgot Ukraine. That first everybody was interested in revolution of dignity, but in a way that people forgot that there's still a war going on, you know. And also when you think about, you know, the future of Ukraine and how difficult it is to fight against corruption, then I felt that this corruption and how it affects the everyday life of ordinary people is something that I really need to write about, because, well, for example, from Nordic point of view, it is actually corruption is a bit abstract in a way that we don't understand how it affects, you know, for example, your healthcare. And we don't understand how it affects vaccines, for example. We don't understand that it's kind of everyday struggle for Ukrainians. And I wanted to write about that reality. And also, when we think about, you know, Ukraine before 2014 was, you know, considered extremely corrupt country, which it was. But what is also important to understand is that the money was stolen from ordinary people, and there's a small bunch of people, those oligarchs, who robbed the nation and then flushed the money to West or to Russia. And so it's not, you know, that Ukrainians are supposed to accuse of being corrupt, but that, you know, the rest of the world has actually enabled the corruption. And this is kind of the story I wanted to write about. And I wanted to also keep reminding of the reasons why revolution really took off in 2013 and 14. Why people started to resist the Russian-minded government and the president, why it happened, because I have a feeling that people started to forget that and just, you know, didn't. And when you write a novel, then it's anyway, it's something, novel is for the future. It's also for the future generations. And also one very important thing that motivated me was that, you know, in Finland, they don't really publish Ukrainian authors. They don't really publish books. Well, now since February, it's changing. But I was expecting that every time there's something happening, you know, something hot happening in the world, then, you know, publishers start publishing books about that. Like, you know, after Balkan Wars, they started to publish authors from that region. But that didn't really happen with Ukraine. And so I really felt like, okay, that I got fed up with that, and then I thought, okay, you know, stop complaining, Sophie, get to work. And I'm hoping also that my work is encouraging publishers to get interested in Ukraine as a literary area, and that there is a culture that, you know, requires, you know, wider audience. And I hopefully, even though my input in this project is a very small one, then anyway, I wanted to contribute to this.
Are your books read in Russian?
I do have 2 books translated into Russian, Purge, and then When the Doves Disappeared as well. It was complicated it was complicated and interested in that way that, well, first of all, When the Dust is Spared was a book that was published in Finnish 2013, and it came out a few years later in English. And it's about the history of active measures in Soviet Union. The reason why I wanted to write about this, about people who wrote the falsified history in Soviet Union, was because at the same time, Russia was using exactly the same methods in Western countries and in Eastern European countries and in Baltic states. The active measures were exactly the same, with, of course, with tools they got from online and the digital world, but otherwise the framework and the idea and the methods were the same. And Western countries didn't understand these methods because they didn't understand that that's like, you know, something Russia and Soviet Union had been using for a very long time, and Putin as a KGB agent is an expert on these. And so I wanted to, you know, write about that this has happened before, and in that way that, you know, that there's a long history of that. And that was the book that was published by a Russian publishing house who had bank accounts in Latvia. They were living in Cyprus, but the official address was in Moscow. And this, with this combination, the publication as such was easy. But with the Purge, I had a different publishing house. And before the book was printed, I got a PDF because we have learned to require the PDF of the translation beforehand. And it's in my contract as well. And I noticed that they have an anonymous person had written a foreword, a sort of reading instructions to the book. And that was quite interesting read because it was saying that I'm a Nazi lover. You know, it was a very propagandist, and it was giving a reading instructions for a Russian reader to keep in mind that this gay Russian Nazi lover author is writing about this fascist and also accusing of Russians being drunken pigs. That was exactly the words I found there. And then of course, we notified the Russian publishing house with the help of lawyers. We got rid of the that. But there were also other interesting complications. For example, they refused, for the Purge, the publishing house was located in Russia. And they, for example, refused to distribute the books to Baltic states, which meant, I mean, there's a huge Russian-speaking minority in all Baltic states. So booksellers definitely wanted to have the book available, but the only way they could actually get the book was to, you know, carry the books from Russia by their bare hands to Estonia. So of course the number of the books was limited, but so there was a distributional problem. So there are all sorts of different ways to you know, to diminish the freedom of expressions already back then, in a way that it is, you know, they did print that, but then they created all sorts of little incidents around the book.
I'm conscious of time, and Jeff, I'll hand back to you
Yeah.
just in a second. But if I can just have one more question in between, one other thing, rather, I'd like to hear what you think about it, which is that clearly, you know, now the narrative, the power to create narrative within Russia seems to be almost as strong as it ever was, despite the fact that we have this huge explosion of digital media. What would you think, you know, as a person who creates narrative herself, how do you think, what is the way to deal with this? How can this be met?
Yes, after the post-truth or after we understood that we are living in the world of post-truth, or more like post-confidence or post-trust, quite many people said that, you know, you you can tackle lies with truth and facts. And it's a beautiful idea. But when we, and I would like to say that that is our best weapon against, you know, Russian propaganda. But now we can also hear all the time Ukrainians who have family living in Russia, and the family members don't believe that their relatives are in a bomb shelter, even though they are calling from the bomb shelter and saying that, you know, that we are being attacked, and they simply don't believe that. So I'm not sure if we can tackle lies only by facts. It's definitely, of course, important, but the most important thing is to win the narration. And win the narration, and that is something that Ukrainians are definitely getting better all the time compared to where they were at in 2013. So they are in control of the narration. But only in Western countries. There's 2/3 of the world, you know, somewhere there, who have no idea what Ukraine is, no idea about the Ukrainian narration, no idea about anything what we are actually saying or experiencing here. They are just, you know, believing what Russia is, Russian lies. And that's another challenge that we need to fight with. And again, I do believe in the power of fiction. And now I talk about fiction as art, not as a Russian fiction, but as a literary fiction and art, movies, because, you know, people do read also in African continent. They might not be that much, you know, of course, you know, your books are expensive in many African countries, but I do have readers, for example, in those countries where they read English, Arab, or French. So, and of course, when you think about India and China, then it's very difficult, you know, to fight with our weapons to a country where we have limited access, or the accessibility of the Western stories or Ukrainian stories is limited. So, but one thing is that we should, of course, also keep in mind that it would be very important to have journalists from different African countries in Ukraine. It's not only important that Western journalists are there, but also, you know, because thanks to this new sort of Holodomor Putin is trying to execute, then we do need also, because this hunger method Putin is using is going to anyway affect, you know, southern countries as well. So they do have journalists as well. So in that way, this is their story, and they might not even think that it is their story as well, but it is. But I think, you know, in the end, we come to that huge task of educating people, and only education is something that can, you know, can help. But I mean, that's I'm afraid that is a task for the future generations. We cannot solve it now.
Absolutely. And my task.
But anyway, one more thing about the fiction is that fiction creates empathy, and in that way, I think empathy is definitely something that can fight against propaganda. I mean, no matter what Russian propaganda is, you know, pouring over the world, then they are anyway creating hatred against Ukraine and against Western countries. But stories, narrations, fiction, no matter what the form is, can create the empathy. And empathy is anyway the strongest weapon, I think, against propaganda.
Yeah.
In addition to the education and empathy.
Okay, the two E's. Jeff, come back in.
So Francine, thank you, and Sophie, thank you very much. This has been very stimulating. I'm going to ask a question or two while any of you get ready by putting your question in chat or using the raised hand function, and I'll call on you in moments. I have one question for Francine and then one question for both of you. Francine, when I hear words like truth and narrative and empathy and understanding, I think of your 1999 novel, your first novel, A Foreign Country. And I either made this up or I read it somewhere that in this book of yours, the past is a foreign country. And it seems to me of many of the services you provided in this brilliant work of fiction, you help us with different lenses through which we can look at history, relationships, and the truth that binds us. Could you give us a succinct summary of the book, and could you tell us what you were trying to get after?
Okay, well, I'll start with where the title comes from. The title is actually stolen from another British author, L.P. Hartley, who wrote a novel called The Go-Between, which was actually set in Edwardian times, but he prefaced it with the little phrase, that, or he actually begins the novel, I think, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. And I think that's it's that sense of how our perspective changes over time, which is partly to do with truth, but it's also to do with the fact that there is a set of, there's a set of morals at one time, or there is the kind of group think, if you like, and then that moves on and people can be judged quite harshly by that. This is not to do necessarily with obviously basic humanitarian things. This is not to do with atrocities as such, but in this case, I was dealing with the case of Italians who were living in Britain and who during the early stages of the Second World War, when it was not absolutely clear, well, Italy was on one side, obviously, and then they changed sides later in the war. But at the time where Italy appeared to be at war with Britain, then or on the point of being at war because Mussolini and Hitler were allied, then the Italians under Churchill's orders, the Italians in Britain were rounded up summarily on absolutely the thinnest of evidence, on the grounds that there was a very complicated network, intelligence network of pro-fascist, that the Italians were fomenting fascism within Britain. And the less evidence that was found of that by the investigating British authorities, then the more convinced they became that that network of Italians supposedly fomenting fascism was so sophisticated that they just couldn't see it. But it must be there, and it must be there, very powerful. So people who had made England their home, who in some cases had children who were volunteering for the British Army, they were just rounded up. They had all their assets frozen, and they were treated as enemies, partly because it actually suited the British government at that point to have a sense of a real threat at home, because we were during what was called the phony war period there. And I think, the war hadn't come to Britain, but in order to make it seem more apparent, the government of the time decided that this exercise in identifying enemy aliens was something that we know governments have done this before. This is not unique to that particular government, but it was part of a process of finding an outsider, if you like, and finding the outsider makes supposedly everybody else bind together. So I was fascinated. I'd come across, while researching the program some years prior to that, I'd come across the case of certain Italians and a particularly tragic event that befell some of them. And I started to research it, and I found it fascinating. I also found it fascinating because it had certain echoes with kind of political movements that's still going on, things that still happen. I mean, you could argue in some ways that same sort of question of identifying an outsider and saying the Falklands War with Argentina, some of the arguments about Brexit and Europe that have gone on here, which were as much to do with one political party trying to find a cohesive force within it and doing that by identifying an outsider. But of course, times change, regimes change, perspectives change, and history does not judge a lot of people who in some cases thought they were doing things for the best of possible reasons, because we can all delude ourselves at some level. I wanted to go back and just look at that sort of the way that those shifts occur and how cultural and political changes can carry on.
Francine, thank you. That's very helpful. I'm looking for hands as I ask my second question to both of you, also relevant to the question of truth and narrative. It seems to me, well, let me pose it in the form of a question. For those of us who consider ourselves fair-minded and committed to the investigation and the exploration of truth, how do you think about that in a moment where, as Sophie said, we live in this post-truth universe, so-called, and where the demagogues are brilliant and skillful in weaponizing information? And for them, let me stipulate to you, truth is an expression, an extension of power, and profit for them that trust has eroded. Let me give you two examples. During the Trump presidency, there was an individual, a voter, quoted in the Washington Post, who said, "I know Donald Trump lies. I trust him more than the others." Let me tell you about a Georgetown student of mine who worked in Eastern Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea and the first invasion in 2014. He told me that ethnic Russian friends of his went overnight from being apolitical to ferociously pro-Putin, not because of facts, but Vladimir Putin knew the chords to strike. And as he put it to me, this graduate student, in the battle of hearts and minds, Putin understood hearts come first. There's a lot in what I posed. But Sophie first and the new Francine, for those of us on this side of the debate, it feels daunting. We don't want to respond in kind. We want to stick to methods of integrity and honesty and search for truth. How do we think about it? What do we do, if I may say, to arm ourselves? Because I think the battle will be ongoing for some time.
I think people have to, also in Western countries, we need to have, and we do have many of the people have a feeling that we can actually make the difference. Not everybody. I mean, think about, every single one don't use their right to vote. But what's different in Russia is that people don't think that they can make the difference in politics. And in that way, they are not citizens. And then again, in Ukraine, people definitely are citizens. There's a citizenship. They are agents in their own country. And that's why also the revolution 2014 was so important, because every single one could participate and make the difference. And that's why for Putin it's so important to destroy Ukraine, because at the same time he's destroying the idea of citizenship. So, but I'm not sure if we can affect, change this in Russia. But to secure our democracy, we would need to make our citizens understanding or aware of their citizenship, and that they can make the difference by voting. And what I think is one of the problem is that when you think about those people who are, well, for example, who vote for Trump or other same kind of politicians, even though they know, they accept their lies, and still they might vote. And this kind of thinking, again, we can fight back with education, but what we also need to do is to make the people to get the feel that there's something they can identify with, and no matter what it is. And if they are identifying with things like or communities spreading hate speech or populistic, if that is where they are actually getting their strength from, then we need to try to somehow address the problems. Why do they need this kind of unifying experience from these communities? That is, of course, something extremely difficult, and it might be easier in geographically smaller countries than in the States, where every single state is such a huge country. But that's the same thing with Russia. There are a lot of time zones. It's easier for a smaller country, I think.
Thank you, Francine.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is so fantastically difficult. There is in a sense, that's how do we fight this? You know, that the very language of how do we fight it is kind of makes me alarmed a little bit. But on the other hand, clearly there is a huge task there. Unfortunately, I don't think it's a quick task, and I don't think that there's an easy win on it. But I do think, going back to what Sophie was saying earlier, that this kind of empathy thing, this kind of understanding what you're up against, understanding the nature of how this works. When people talked about, I talked some years ago, I talked to a senior British military person who said, and I said, Putin, what about? And he said, oh, don't worry, Putin's, we've got a handle on Putin. It's fine, it's fine. I said, well, it wasn't. And it really wasn't. And also, it wasn't, because I do remember being in Moscow reporting, and actually also in Ukraine as well, reporting on the first exercises in so-called democracy, in the late 80s, moving towards the 1990, and how people would say, Russians would say to you, well, Gorbachev, he's fine, but he's not the strong leader that we need. And to understand that people have a very, very deep historical association with strong leaders, and therefore somehow to find some kind of way of still creating an empathy with them while respecting their historic expectations. I think that's the thing that's for it. So it comes down to sort of trying to find some way that we can move together. And as you say, it's empathy, trying to find, not to completely break that and to say, no, you're wrong, but to find some way of saying, we share this, because you do find even the vox pops with, little old ladies and whatever, they say, I'm for the war, but I want everybody to be at peace, So it's trying to find those ways through, but this is so difficult within the rhetoric of politics.
So we are almost out of time. I'm not always good at recognizing on my screen of my mini iPad hands. Carolyn, is anybody who has a hand up? We would give them 60 seconds for one question.
So we have
there's a hand.
Fritz Heinsden has his hand up.
So Fritz, you will have the question. If you could do it in 60 seconds, give or take, and then we'll get a reply and we'll wrap up. Fritz, thank you.
Very good. I'll go right to the heart of it then. Ms. Oksanen, thank you for being here today. I'm very curious, because this is such historic times for Finland, for Sweden, for NATO, and so on. Did you willingly enter into the public debate on membership in NATO? Were you maybe dragged into the debate? So I'll abbreviate right at that. Just your thoughts, please.
Oh well, but personally, I wasn't in Finland at the time when in May nor in April. But when I think about the older years, I have been into NATO debates, which have been in Finland very complicated. So it was a kind of fast line, definitely this spring. And it went much more smoothly than expected, or than I was actually expecting. Not because of Russia, but I think the key role was simply the news. We didn't have actually a debate because people were checking on what's happening in Ukraine. And when you see what Russia is doing in Ukraine, then for Finland, with the same kind of history with Russia, Soviet Union at the time, then there's no question about that Finns are saying, okay, this is our neighbor and it's acting like that in Ukraine. It has acted like that in Finland before. Okay, now bye, we don't want this. So in that way, it wasn't actually, I'm not sure if we can even call a debate, because the public opinion changed so quickly. It was just over the night. Sweden is kind of more complicated. I think Sweden just followed Finland. Sweden doesn't have, because they have a very long history with peace. So they are not prepared for war. They have no any kind of, personal relationship with the war narration. For Finns, war is a personal family history, because our grandparents went to war. My Finnish grandfather was a war veteran fighting in the Soviet Union. My father-in-law was a teenager at the time when Soviet Union attacked Finland. So in that way, it's definitely our personal family history. So you don't kind of need to remind, or Ukraine is reminding us every day what the war means, but Sweden doesn't have that. So in that, they let the defense go down. And so I think in that way, certainly this was the first time, probably for centuries, when actually Sweden let Finland lead the way. Usually Sweden is not thinking that Finland is a kind of little brother. So in that way, that it's not considered like, that we need to follow Finland. No. But this was actually the first time probably for, I don't know when, Sweden was following our lead. On the other hand, I don't think NATO is as essential for Sweden, because Finland is Sweden's defense, simply. We are between them and Russia. So in that way, they don't need that. But then again, because their own defense wasn't that great, they didn't think about. So in that way, I guess that they thought this is okay. This is just, easier to not to be the only non-NATO state in this region.
So Fritz,
I appreciate Finland's leadership. Thank you.
Fritz, thank you. And Sophie, thank you. So here we go in wrap up. And Sophie and Francine will have the last word, because I have a last question for them. But first, Carolyn, thank you, Managing Editor, American Purpose. Sid Lipsit, who is Arts and Culture Editor, whose vision drives these things. Thank you, Sid, for this organization and curation of the program today. Second, it seems to me that when we look back at this period in 10 or 15 or 20 years, I don't think that we'll look back and say, with all the problems they had, that it was a lack of IQ points or a lack of ambition or a lack of industriousness. But what was the problem, or what is the problem? Based on this conversation, hearing you, Francine, hearing Sophie, empathy comes up again and again. And among our many deficits in our politics, our public life, our society, I wonder if that's something that really needs consideration and introspection and tending through different media. My last question for wrap up to Sofi first and Francine second. Summer is moving quickly. We're in mid-July. Sofi, if you would give us a tip on what you or what we ought to be reading or watching or listening to, we'd like a tip or two from you right now.
Well, one of my favorite shows, TV shows this year was actually Station 11. Station 11 on HBO, and it's when I say that it's a post-pandemic TV show, everybody's thinking, "Oh my God, this sounds horrible," but no, it was actually produced before COVID. So in that way, it was just coincidence that it came out at the same time when we were going through the pandemic. But it is one of the most hopeful TV shows about a catastrophe and the importance of art. And even though, you know, in that TV, in Station 11, it's about pandemia or the post-world after, the world after pandemia, then it could be any other catastrophe as well. It could be, you know, a horrible war, or, you know, when you are on ground zero, the humanity is going through with the past that is too much to bear. But, you know, it's about how art is healing, and it is, even though it's about catastrophe, it is fitting for the time because it's so beautifully hopeful.
Wonderful. Thank you. Francine, what do you want us to read or watch or listen to?
Well, I would say acquaint yourself maybe with one thing before the end of the summer with a Ukrainian writer, or you know, and I probably Sophie could give better recommendations than I could for contemporary Ukrainian writers, but I would say maybe go back and look at some historic Russian and maybe Gogol, maybe go back, you know, even further. I think we just have to acquaint ourselves. You know, this is the empathy idea, isn't it? Read something that's outside your normal mindset, or watch an extraordinary piece of, you know, watch a film or something. It's difficult to recommend new releases because who knows where they're being seen where or whatever at the moment. But I think it's just give yourself a break, think differently, and let's hope that, you know, a bit of fresh thinking comes to all of us as a result of that.
So that is a perfect way to end a beautiful and stimulating conversation. For all of you and your valuable time, thank you so much. And Francine and Sofi, warmest thanks. What a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Be well.
Bye.